Hello, my name is Walter Simonson. I write and draw comic books. And with this pencil, I'm going to do a drawing today in front of you, which I hope will turn out well, but we'll have to see. I've done a lot of comics for a lot of years. I did Thor for Marvel for a number of years, did the Fantastic Four. I did the adaptation of Alien for Heavy Metal, and had a great time. Some years ago, one of my friends asked me if I would like to do my own version of the Norse myths, which I thought would be very cool. And I thought about it for a while, and eventually I decided it would be cool to do. Well, the thing about the Norse myths, we've all read them, or you can get a book about them, you can do whatever you want. There's a lot of comics out there, especially at Marvel, but other places as well. And the idea with a comic, if you can, is not to tell the same story that's already been told. So I thought about that, and I wasn't sure quite what to do for a story. It didn't feel like it had been told a million times already. And ultimately, I got the idea, I was in my car actually. I was driving to a Borders bookstore, which is, that shows how long ago this was, when Borders was still around. And I had the idea for a Thor story where in the Norse myths, there's something called Ragnarok. We know more about it from the Marvel movie recently, but the idea is that unlike a lot of mythologies, the Norse mythology covers the end of the universe. And what that means is, at the end of time, the Norse gods and their enemies all get together on a giant battle plane called Vigrid, and they have a fight. And each one of the gods goes up against his opposite number in the bad guys. And they kill each other. And so by the time it's over, only one main bad guy is left. There's a fire giant called Surtur who kills the god he goes up against, but survives the encounter. But because everything is going away, everything is dying. Even Surtur can't survive. He has a giant flaming sword, and he takes his sword and he flings fire across the 9 worlds, and everything burns. Stars fall from the sky, the earth sinks into the giant ocean that surrounds everything, and ultimately, everything is dark. Then, after a time, the earth comes back, it's reborn, things begin again. Well, I thought about it. I like that story. It's a fabulous story. It's in a book called The Elder Edda. It's in a poem called Voluspa. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading. I thought about that, and I thought, since every god has his opposite number, and they all fight each other, what would happen if Thor, who is generally a god who looks after the ordinary man, ordinary humans, let's say he's not there. And that means the creature, the Midgard serpent, a giant worm that he fights, survives. In the myths, Thor kills him with his hammer. As the serpent dies, and the serpent is big enough to encircle the entire world, it gives forth an effluvia of blood or ichor or poison or whatever you want to call it, and it blows forth, and Thor takes 9 steps backwards and falls and drowns and dies at the hand of the serpent as the serpent's dying. So my thought was, how about if I do a story in which Thor isn't on the battlefield at Vigrid, and because he's not there, things don't go the way they do in the myths. And that means the gods die. But the bad guys do not. What happens then? Well, the bad guys take over. The 9 worlds survive. The world tree Yggdrasil falls. And I view kind of a medieval world of agrarian life and lords and serfs and bad guys in charge of everything. Hundreds of years later, that didn't work too well, let's try that again. Hundreds of years later, Thor comes back. He doesn't know what's happened, but he's no dummy, and he finds out pretty quickly. His family's gone, all his fellow gods are gone. Basically, the world he knew is gone. And all the bad guys who made it happen, who were in charge of everything, are still around. Thor isn't very pleased about this. He has his magic hammer, Mjolnir, which when you throw it, comes back to him. And is very deadly. It was the gods' principal weapon against their traditional enemies, the frost giants. So he basically picks up his hammer and goes back into what's left of the 9 worlds to seek out the great enemies and discuss with them the matter of all things. And that's my comic. The comic's called Ragnarok, being published by IDW. I have 2 story arcs done so far, which is 12 issues. The first arc is really mostly set up for what I've already told you, where we find out what's going on. Thor comes back and begins to figure out what's happening. And then at the end of the 6 issues, he goes out into what's left of the 9 worlds to begin to try and find the great enemies and deal with them. In the second arc, there turns out to be a guy who has set himself up as the new Lord of the Dead, because Hel herself, Loki's daughter, who was in charge of Helheim, the land of the dead, has been missing since Ragnarok. No one knows what's happened to her. So this guy has taken over and has decided that he would like to control what's left of the 9 worlds. And in doing so, he's amassing an army, as you would expect, weapons, all that stuff, and an army of the dead. In the Norse myths, they're called the Draugr. So he's found Draugr, he's gathered them to himself, building up this army. Thor has to deal with them. I won't say more than that. I don't want to give away my stories. But it's enabled me to go back and visit the Norse myths, revisit them, and tell a story that I have not told before. And I really haven't seen it from anybody else in quite the same way. So hopefully, if you decide you want to read it, it will not feel like Norse stories or stories based on the Norse myths that you've come across before. And that's the character I'm drawing right now, is my version of Thor. One thing he doesn't have a lower jaw. Now originally, I did that for fun. I just thought it would look cool. I did some drawings. I liked the way it looked. So I drew this guy with no lower jaw. I did not really expect to leave him without a lower jaw. But as I drew him, as I drew his adventures, I never got around to having him find his lower jaw. He just looked so cool that way. I left him like that. Now, I'm not saying I'm going to leave him like that the whole time. I have a number of more stories I want to tell. I have an ending already in mind for where I want to go. It'll be some issues off still. It's not happening immediately. I have several story arcs I'd like to tell. Mike Mignola, who does Hellboy, Mike gave me an idea for how to get Thor's jaw back, which was pretty cool. And I've had a couple of ideas myself. So, I don't know what's going to happen with that. As long as I think he looks really cool. I think if he looks really cooler without his jaw than with it, he may never get it back. But I'll have to see about that. There've been a couple of flashbacks where you can see what he used to look like. But we'll just have to see how that goes. In the meantime, the other thing that happened, I'll fill in a little bit, is when the gods all died, the 9 worlds fell apart. The balance of all things was out of whack. If you've read a writer named Michael Moorcock, you're familiar with the great balance. I haven't used that, but Michael's work was fantasy work, a very important fantasy writer in the last century and into the beginning of this one. Wrote stories in which there was a great balance. And in my stories, I've borrowed the idea, at least of balance, not so much Michael's idea of an actual balance. But in my stories, with the worlds out of balance, what they've done is they've collapsed. When Yggdrasil, the world tree, fell, the 9 worlds fell themselves and collapsed into a vast land. In the myths, the sun and the moon, before Ragnarok, are pursued by 2 wolves, each by a wolf. And when Ragnarok comes, the wolves catch the sun and the moon and devour them. Now that's all that's in the poetry. They don't tell you what happened to the wolves. But I can tell you what happened to the wolves, because really, if you eat the sun and the moon, you're toast. So, the wolves die, they fall into what's left of the 9 worlds, and so now, somewhere in this vast land that's made up of all 9 worlds, the carcasses of these 2 gigantic wolves are lying, rotting away, and the sun and the moon, sun's in one, the moon's in the other, and the light shines out through what's left of the wolves. So the light never changes. There's no night, there's no day. It's always kind of like twilight. So the realm that these creatures now inhabit, all my creatures, my characters, my Thor, is called the Dusklands. And all the 9 worlds are somewhere within the Dusklands. Some of them, like Asgard, are in ruins because that's what the enemies of the gods did to it. Some of them are less ruinous, but they're still a mess. The 9 worlds are a mess. And that's really what my story is about. That's the theater of my story. And I'll do that over there. Actually, this is a magic tool for artists. I decided I want to change where his hair is going. I kind of like the idea that it should be out over here there we go. All right. I think we'll go with that. And here's my secret. It's not really a secret anymore. I put this in a comic in 1974, so it's not really a secret. But my last name is Simonson. When I was in school, before I became an artist, I'd always drawn. I wanted to be a paleontologist, study dinosaurs. So I developed a signature between 11th and 12th grade. When I write Simonson, I write it like that. It's S-I-M-O-N-S-O-N. That's the dinosaur. That's the head and the eye. That's the neck. That's the hump over the back, and that's the tail. So I did my signature as a Brontosaurus. And because they got rid of the name Brontosaurus for the actual animal, I now believe this to be the only Brontosaurus in captivity. My signature. That way, I'm able to put a Brontosaurus and a dinosaur in every drawing I do. I'm Walter Simonson. This is Ragnarok Thor.